Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of the Sunday live edition of Adam's Music Box. And after some technical difficulties, the gremlins in the computer box have assured me that we are in fact live. Now, there have been many musical beefs over the years, and I was asked about this one. This one comes as a special request, and it is: what was the beef between Richard Wagner and Friedrich Nietzsche? One of the more interesting, if not frivolous, and I would argue irrelevant beefs of the 19th century when it came to music, but it's one that has captured the imagination of millions of people around the world for a considerable. Do something there for a considerable amount of time. And so I want to explore it. I want to explore the significance assigned to it by the people having the beef. I want to explore the significance to us, the listeners, and the significance of people who are observing the beef unfold in real time. For those who don't know, and I think that if you are a regular viewer of this channel, you probably will know. Richard Wagner was one of the most important composers, one of the most important conductors, one of the most important musical and philosophical minds of all time. I would argue that along with Beethoven, Wagner was the most important of all the great European composers. And to learn more about him, just type in his name, Wagner is how it's spelled, into the little magnifying glass search feature on this channel, because I have done many videos about him. Now, who was Nietzsche? Nietzsche was one of the most important metaphysical philosophers and moral philosophers of all time, and he and Wagner were friends, and that is where the story begins. I'll also add that Nietzsche, in addition to writing a lot about music and loving music, was a composer himself. Most of his compositions are not very well known, but after his death, they were recorded. But he is obviously known more as a philosopher who happened to compose music, where Wagner, interestingly, is more known as a composer who happened to philosophize, albeit a lot of his philosophy was very instrumental in creating the modern European orchestral tradition, including the way conducting is approached, the way orchestral playing is approached, the way the orchestra itself sounds. That's the introduction, away and done with. So, Wagner and Nietzsche. Wagner was already quite famous by the time Nietzsche befriended him. And when Nietzsche befriended Wagner, he, in his philosophical writings, described Wagner as a kind of much needed savior of the European soul. He was interjecting a Dionysian spirit into a culture that had been essentially weakened and overly dogmatized by Enlightenment values that Nietzsche saw as just as constraining and dogmatic and insufficient to the wild and unbridled Dionysian spirit of the true philosophical king, if you will. He didn't like Plato, but I just used a Platonic phrase. He saw that Wagner was the anecdote to both of the old feudal Europe and of the Enlightenment Europe, both of which Nietzsche found insufficient and overly sanitized from both the psychological, sociological, and moral perspective. And the two became friends. And in Wagner's early writings, such as in Nietzsche's early writings, such as The Birth of Tragedy, he writes copiously about how much he loved Wagner's music and spirit. Now, Nietzsche's love of Wagner was very pronounced. And what's very interesting is that by the time we get to books like Ecce Homo and Human All Too Human, in sort of the middle of Nietzsche's career, he begins turning on Wagner by sort of inverting the praise on which he bestowed upon Wagner earlier on. So while for the early Nietzsche, Wagner was this sort of savior figure, this figure injecting life and vitality and an unbridled spirit into European musical culture, by the time you get 10 years, or even I think maybe 8 to 10 years down the road, don't quote me on the numbers, we get a Nietzsche who writes about Wagner as though he's everything that he was supposedly saving European culture from. The Wagner of Nietzsche's middle career was someone who was diseased, someone who was overly moralizing, someone who was a priest rather than a kind of unbridled, wild creature. I wrote down a few quotes, a few of Nietzsche's insults, and I think you'll notice something interesting. So he went from calling Wagner an honored friend to calling him demonic, calling him Wagner is one who has suffered so. No, this was one of the praiseworthy quotes. He said Wagner is one who has suffered so much, and this elevates him above other musicians. I can't read and talk at the same time, but we are getting somewhere, I do assure you. I admire Wagner whenever he sets himself to music, and these are all of these great. Words of praise. He also said, Wagner is modernity in concentrated form. Through Wagner, modernity speaks her most intimate language. So here you see Wagner being this savior of modern Europe, this person whose larger than life personality and art was something that brought a level of salvation. But just a few years later, we're seeing Nietzsche say this: Wagner's art is diseased. Wagner belongs only to my diseases. Everything Wagner touches is contaminated. His music makes me sick. He is the great corrupter of music. Bayreuth is grand opera and not even good opera. And so I think we see this one's quite interesting too. Wagner is bad for young men. He is fatal for women. And as Nietzsche got older and older, his hatred of Wagner only progressed. And the nadir of Nietzsche's views on Wagner came in Wagner's lost work, which was the great opera, one of the finest, if perhaps the finest of all time, Parsifal. And Nietzsche truly hated this. He hated the Christian redemptive story arc of Parsifal. He hated the explicitly Christian themes that Wagner inserted into it. And Wagner, who himself got in touch with his Christianity more and more overtly as his life progressed, and the apotheosis of Wagner's Christianity was in Parsifal, this was something that Nietzsche detested. And once Wagner died in 1883, Nietzsche became even more scathing about Wagner. But there's more to it than meets the eye. And a lot of this sort of nuance comes from the fact that if you take Nietzsche literally, you're not really reading Nietzsche at all. Nietzsche, in many ways, was the first ultra modern philosopher in the sense that he didn't write long, lugubrious tractates like Immanuel Kant, for instance. He wrote typically in relatively short or even bite sized aphorisms, meaning that reading a book by Nietzsche is almost like reading a set of tweets or ex posts. Not ex post factos, that is, in succession. That's not to say that his writing was simplistic. It was most certainly not. There was so much in it. Someone, I think it might have been Walter Kaufmann, but don't quote me on it, said that well, most late 19th century philosophers, like Hegel, for instance, took 100 pages to get a single point across. Nietzsche was someone who could get multiple convoluted and, to the untrained mind, contradictory ideas across in just a couple of sentences. Again, Twitter would have been really handmade for him, not least because he loved to stir up drama. He loved to insult people in a witty way that was filled with double entendre. And much like at least a clever user of Twitter, he was someone who was full of double entendre, full of scathing humor, full of sarcasm, and much like Sun Tzu instructed one in a battle to use the element of confusion to your advantage, so too did Nietzsche harness and master the element of confusion to his advantage. And so some of what he says about Wagner, while private epistles from Nietzsche do indicate that the hatred was real, the beef was real, there are also things that are unintentionally funny about it. Because one of the great things about great comedians, and Nietzsche, in addition to being a great philosopher, was a great comedian, is that you don't don't always know when he's being earnest and when he's being humorous, when he's being sardonic, when he's being scatological and sarcastic. And so some of the stuff, especially if you're well versed in 18th and 19th century music, is very funny. So Wagner is he was a towering figure of profundity. And everyone, including at one point Nietzsche, knew so in Wagner's lifetime. And so when you read Nietzsche comparing Wagner negatively to the comparative light music of Bizet or Rossini, you think this has to be a joke, which isn't to say that I dislike Bizet and Rossini. They're great composers, but to compare them to Wagner, to most people, would be a joke. Is Nietzsche joking? Is he isn't? Well, I think it's a little bit of both. There's definitely shock value. There's a shock jock element to Nietzsche's criticisms of many things. Again, perfect for the age of social media. But the point that Nietzsche was making is that where he once saw Wagner as a Dionysian spirit, this sort of spirit of all ages that has no beginning or end, who injected vitality and a kind of eros into your modern European music. By the end of Nietzsche's life, he sees Wagner as this sort of lumbering character insistent on making points. Some could say the same of Nietzsche and some of Nietzsche's peers, and that instead characters in the musical composition world like Rossini and Bizet were clean, they were pure, they were honest in their music. Their music was beautiful without insisting upon itself. These aren't my criticisms, these are Nietzsche's. I think Wagner was perfect. I think Wagner was great. I think Wagner was a great mind. And I think as a man, he was superior to Nietzsche. And we'll get to why in a little bit. But so these criticisms, they read almost comically if you know what these composers mean and what they stand for. He also elevated Mozart and Chopin to a degree above Wagner in his angry phase as well. But Nietzsche, again, was a figure that toyed with people's expectations. On the one hand, he saw Wagner in the early days as bringing a Dionysian sort of Hellenic essence to a German people who were in need of reinvigoration. By the end of Nietzsche's career, when Germany had united, it became a United Nations state, culminating in 1871. This was something that Nietzsche opposed. He loathed the idea of Germany as a nation state, loathed the idea of German national fervor and national folkish culture. One of his quotes, "How much beer is there in German music?" which was meant to be sort of an insult that had become too much for the demos and too little for the philosopher king. And he exalted a lot of cultures in modern Europe that you wouldn't necessarily think he would. Southern cultures, Italic culture, as sort of the antidote to a modern Germany that Nietzsche saw as fake, as contrived, as sort of one that had all of the trappings of a great civilization, but without the essence of it. Wagner, by contrast, was the de facto artistic king of the modern United Germany. He was the biggest celebrity in the arts at the time, the world's most foremost composer, and he was someone who had argued about the need for Germans to reinvigorate a consciously Germanic culture, comparing the disunited Germany of his early life negatively to a united France. Interestingly, it was during a French conductor's performance of Beethoven's Ninth in the 1830s that Wagner became convinced that he needed to revive and really invent a modern German conducting tradition. Lo and behold, he did. And some of the greatest recorded artists of all time were proteges of the people that Wagner knew and taught. People like Furtwängler, people like Muck, the Dutch composer, but with Germanic cultural characteristics and background, Mengelberg. And I've talked about these conductors many a time on previous streams. And so there is a reality to the sense that Nietzsche and Wagner philosophically did diverge in their views on German culture, on the German state, German national fervor, German national folkishness. There was a clear and genuine divide in those areas. But the level of vitriol, the vindictive and acerbic nature of Nietzsche's of Nietzsche's sort of criticisms of Wagner, these were very much something that I think you need to read somewhat tongue in cheek, because people say that anger is, there's a fine line between love and hate, and there may well be. In fact, I believe there is. But anger, which is different than hate, there's a fine line between anger and humor. And I would argue that that line is even finer, even more opaque than the line between love and hate. And the reason is because anger is always over the top. It's the opposite of restraint. Because even if you feel disappointed with someone, or feel that someone is evil or incorrect or stupid or any of these generally negative attributes, you don't necessarily need to boil over because of it. But when you do, the name for it is anger. And there is, because of the implicit nature of anger, a hyperbolic aspect of this emotion. And someone like Nietzsche, who used humor and wordplay and double entendre, he was in fact the master of wordplay. You'd be hard pressed to find someone as playful with his words as Nietzsche. There's an element, whether intended or unintended, and sometimes Nietzsche's unintended was intended, for when you gaze long enough into the abyss gazes back into you. And when you go out fighting with monsters, you will find that you become the monster you fight. That's what Nietzsche said. And he was, of course, applying it to many men, but he was also applying it to himself. In his love of Wagner, did he become something that he feared Wagner would hate? In his love of Wagner, did he overthink, overanalyze Wagner, and turn this into this loathing of Wagner? There are many different ways that I suppose we could psychoanalyze it. And in terms of the words themselves, how hyperbolic were they? I mean, again, a lot of this comes from books where Nietzsche, even in the titles, are wordplay. Things like The Gay Science, which is a book full of miserable interpretations of metaphysics. And gay at the time didn't mean what it means now. But if you wanted to apply the modern meaning to it, it's sort of even funnier. Human, all too human. It's funnier in German. That sentence doesn't appear much, but trust me, it is. And his final book, Goethe Dämmerung, a wordplay on Wagner's Goethe Dämmerung. So where Wagner composed the final opera of his Ring, which was the Twilight of the Gods, Nietzsche wrote the Twilight of the Idols, and the subheading there, the subtitle, was How to Philosophize with a Hammer. Now, that itself is funny. The idea of philosophizing with a hammer. On the one hand, it's about an iconoclastic way of looking at things. On the other hand, it's about sort of blunt observations. It's not philosophizing with an ice pick. It's philosophizing with a hammer, which, while just as potentially violent as an ice pick, is much less precise. And again, that was some of the humor in it, because when Nietzsche was being precise, he could be universal. And when Nietzsche spoke in universal terms, he could be very precise. Nietzsche pointed out the contradictions in himself and others frequently. And where his moral metaphysics comes in is that, unlike many who seek to resolve contradiction, Nietzsche didn't. Nietzsche saw that contradiction could live peacefully within a single orifice, within a single corporal body, because everything is nothing and nothing is everything. As the Bible says, he who shall be lost shall be first. And these concepts of linguistic, moral, and metaphysical contradiction, for him, they could coexist at the same time. And I actually think that that's not a bad way to look at his views on Wagner, because Nietzsche was one person, and Nietzsche loved Wagner and hated Wagner. That would be the sort of gestalt way of looking at Nietzsche's relationship to Wagner. Of course, the historiographical way to look at it would be, okay, young Nietzsche loved Wagner, middle Nietzsche disliked Wagner, old Nietzsche really loathed Wagner in an extreme way. But I think it's important not to get too hung up on this, because we have to remember that, especially someone with as much of a sense of humor as Nietzsche, and trust me, those who say he doesn't have a sense of humor are misreading him, as many people do. I think it would be unfair to elevate the beef, the feud, into a level of profundity that would make us lose sleep. I mean, many people, because they've been raised with what Spengler would call a kind of Faustian desire to see the world in absolutes, they feel the artificially imposed need to choose between Nietzsche and Wagner, which is really, really quite a symptom of mental retardation, not in a biological sense, but in a self willed sense. It's possible to like both. It's possible to like many people that dislike each other. It's possible to admire adversarial soldiers in a war. I mean, General Patton and General Rommel, who fought on opposite sides in a war, they admired each other greatly. And what more? And if you could ever resolve the idea of contradictions living with each other, two generals whose soldiers were trying to kill those on the other side, respecting each other, sort of vindicates and validates the Nietzschean idea of contradiction not necessarily needing to be an impulse. But getting back to wherever I was, and I don't exactly remember where, yeah, you don't need to choose between the two of them because I don't think you need to take the feud that seriously. In any case, it was, pardon me, a one-way feud. Wagner never in his lifetime responded to Nietzsche once the friendship broke apart and Nietzsche started to insult Wagner. Cosima Wagner, Richard's wife, disliked Nietzsche, but stand by your man and all that. And Cosima was very protective and indeed expansive of Wagner's legacy. She was a very good wife to have, unlike some famous widows. But when you look at it, it really does feel like one of these celebrity or political beefs that you see on social media, albeit a one-way beef. Because Nietzsche's insults were short, they were targeted to make Wagner, even if he didn't care, but certainly to make his fans and worshippers, if you will, feel very insulted. He hit them where it hurt because he precisely inverted the praise that he once offered to Wagner, and that tends to sting more than if he sort of came up with an original way to insult his former hero. And great men can be petty. Nietzsche was a great man. He may have died like a loser, but that also, this contradiction doesn't take away from the fact that his philosophical writings and arguably his musical composition as well was great. Again, these things are contradictions, but they're not impossible in terms of insofar as they've reached an impasse. For instance, when was a man great? Was he great when he was an infant, or was he great when he was doing great things? Beethoven was an infant once too. Infants, except to their parents and families, aren't necessarily remarkable. They don't invent things. Beethoven was great when he was at the peak of his artistic prowess. And likewise, Nietzsche was great when he was at the peak of his artistic and philosophical prowess. But I would argue that his beefing with Wagner was a low point for Nietzsche. It was certainly something that Nietzsche seemed to care about. But again, the double entendres and the wordplay make you wonder if part of Nietzsche still didn't like Wagner, and if there may have been more to what meets the eye in terms of the falling out, just as there is typically more than meets the eye when social media influencers, political figures, celebrities, and the like begin to publicly display manifestations of loathing to one another. Now, I did say that Wagner was the superior man, and I'll explain why. This isn't an insult to Nietzsche, who I consider the most important philosopher of modern history. You'd have to go back to the Hellenic and Latin eras to find a more profound philosopher. But Nietzsche died after having gone insane, and there's no really scientifically validated explanation for why. And so it could well be that he died of a metaphysical sickness, if you will, and that his long descent into madness and inarticulation was something of a self inflicted moral wound rather than something physiological or biological. By contrast, Wagner died on top of the world. The enemies in politics, in business, and in art that he had to fight in his earlier life when he was a revolutionary had all either fallen by the wayside or joined his team. The man who had struggled to take a disparate musical culture and unify it with a common sound, a common theme, and a common purpose. He had succeeded in doing so, and the Wagnerian sound came to dominate all of modern European classical music, certainly in Central Europe, arguably internationally. His music was, in his lifetime, some of the most popular in the history of the world, and after his death, even after European classical music became a footnote in the minds of most people, people still love Wagner. They know the leitmotifs. They know them. They can even identify the chord progressions, Wagnerian chord progressions. People say that when John Williams was composing the Star Wars score, populistic music, if there ever was any, he was inspired by Wagner. So Wagner is everywhere. Wagner died a celebrity, died a hero, died a vindicated man. Where Nietzsche died in after what one might, as I said, be classed as self-inflicted insanity. And again, this isn't to take away from the fact that Nietzsche is the most important of all of the modern philosophers, but it is to say that if we judge a man by his fruits, Wagner's were very ripe by the time he died, where Nietzsche sort of needed to be, reconfigured by the time that he died. So I love them both. I think their contribution to the world of art, philosophy, music, and thought is invaluable. I don't want to choose sides. I don't have to choose sides. Nietzsche's philosophy and Wagner's philosophy both indicate that this instinct not to need to choose sides is indeed a correct one. But if you had to judge a man by his fruits, Wagner is the one who comes out on top, although they are both very important men. And like I said, I think if you come away with any single message, it's that the beef wasn't all that important. There was a lot of frivolity to it. There was a lot of the same sort of hyperbolized truth that we see in Twitter feeds, whereby people say things they don't necessarily mean because they feel they sort of want to, stroke have to, and a lot of truth is lost in hyperbole. That's one interpretation. There are many, many others. And we've got a comment about Wagner. Really interesting. Thanks so much. Love Wagner. So many proms performances at the Albert Hall. Yeah, wonderful. People still, even in an age where people, certainly outside of Northeast Asia, where classical music, European classical music, remains much more popular than it does in Europe or North America. Even so, people around the world love Wagner, and I think they always will. There was something about him that, as a revolutionary that became a father of a musical movement, with so much talent, I think he and Beethoven will stand as titans. There are many other composers I love, don't get me wrong, but Beethoven and Wagner were titans. And interestingly, Beethoven was really the only composer before Wagner that Wagner truly exalted. He liked many, but he loved Beethoven, as did Nietzsche. It's one of the things that even in Nietzsche's old age they could agree on, which is probably a good place to end this stream. And for those who came in late, you can always do the rewind to see what's behind. As always, like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.